first I wanted to just kind of go through some of the, I guess you could call almost like truth about fake news, some of the things that we feel we've kind of learned over the last few years. I mean, one of the first pieces of it is that there's lots of different types of things that fall within the larger realm of disinformation, misinformation, information operations, all the different terms that are being used now. This is a graphic from an organization called First Draft that does a lot of work in this area in training, just to kind of reinforce that, you know, it's not just purely false stuff. There are people who, you know, share things with good intentions that turns out to not be true, or that turns out to be misleading. And so this is, you know, them trying to break it down into different kinds of things, all the way from something that's meant to be satire, maybe being misinterpreted, to things that are completely fabricated. And so it is a confusing and complex kind of universe that we're trying to deal with here. And I think recognizing the nuance of it is really important as well. And to give you an idea, one of the other things that I think we've seen over the last few years is that you can have sort of the same result, you can have the same types of, say, content, but they can be created with very different motivations. And so on the left, these are examples from those famous Macedonian teens. These are stories that they were publishing back in 2016. On the right is content that was really paid for and sponsored by the Russian trolls from the Internet Research Agency, also from 2016. And in both cases, these are false claims. These are, kind of partisan-oriented things. But obviously, the Macedonian teens were trying to make money, and the guys on the right were, more doing it for kind of, propaganda means or for partisan means. And yet, in the end, the content can kind of look the same when we encounter it. So we have to get to that next level to understand what's really going on there. It is absolutely a global problem. We have reporters in more than a dozen countries. Our newsroom is about 300 journalists now. So we've certainly been doing reporting, whether it's in the United States, in Europe, in Brazil, India, and other places where we are. And we find that it's a problem everywhere because, of course, the internet is almost everywhere, and social networks are almost everywhere, and messaging apps, depending on, what country you're in, it's a different app. And so we do see things that are, similar from one country to the next, but there certainly are differences as well. But it's definitely a global challenge. Recently, one of our reporter in India teamed up with one of our reporters in San Francisco to really look at a recent incident where false rumors on WhatsApp did lead to kind of mob violence in one small village in India. And so we're trying to use our kind of global newsroom to look at this and to get a broader understanding of it. And having people on the ground does matter. Of course, one of the things that is driving this are, strong political beliefs, polarization. So around elections, we certainly see an uptick in this kind of activity. And of course, within all of us, we have the capacity to believe things that are not true, to hold on to false beliefs because they might be comforting or because they align with what we believe and the way we've been raised. And so this is something that's exploited by these actors, for sure. And they also exploit the networked world, which I'll talk more about in a second. But this is a graphic from the linking patterns between websites in the United States in 2016. And the red groupings are conservative websites, the blue groupings are liberal websites, and you can see, they basically create these powerful networks where people are consuming more and more information from a purely partisan point of view, and there's a big enough universe there that people can sort of live within that and not necessarily head out to other places as well. And this is an effective way to feed people this kind of information, whether it's misleading or false. The other part is that human bias piece of it. This was a great piece by Zeynep Tufekci, who's an academic in the United States. The last point there is belonging is stronger than facts. This is one of the things that we're really going up against here. You can't just give somebody the pure facts and expect them to suddenly change their mind. It's a big effort, and it's an ongoing effort, and I think our presence in communities and our sense of belonging in communities helps us reach people more. So that's where I think local reporting on this level is really, really important. But this is a challenge, and it's within all of us. It's also within journalists. I think sometimes we sort of exclude ourselves and say, well, I'm not going to fall for something, but we could as well. And then, the last sort of piece here is the element of networks and algorithmic filtering. And so, this is an example of people in the United States in a sort of semi-private chat space called Discord, and they're planning to try and spread misinformation about the French election. And so you have Americans from the far right trying to help work with far right people in France to plan these things in private and then to get it out on the more public networks. And so this is a dynamic we see a lot. Stuff happens privately in messaging apps, and then all of a sudden it gets to a public network like Facebook, for example. The creation and purchase of fake accounts is a really common thing we see, and it's very easy to buy them. The ones on the left here, we just exposed in the story this week. They were being used to help promote a candidate in a Massachusetts Senate race. So this, again, is a global thing. And interestingly, a lot of the places that are selling these fake accounts in bulk are often based in Southeast Asia or other parts of Asia. And so there's like a global industry around it, and it's often being bought and then used to target in other countries. Trolling operations, professional trolls, whether they're hired by a state or hired by like a third-party contractor. This is something that's in dozens of countries around the world now. And you know, the photo there is the famous St. Petersburg troll factory. The photo on the right, the image on the right, is from a report from Oxford University, and you can see, you know, the countries that are red, the countries that have a darker shade, there are multiple different kinds of trolling operations going on there. It might be state-sponsored, it might be private industry doing it, and so we see that this is something that's really starting to spread throughout the world. And of course, once you have fake accounts, once you have trolls, you then, you know, get them to spread ideas that are divisive, spread content that is fake. Here's those fake accounts in the United States, dropping content in different Facebook groups to get people to see it and to help it spread organically from there. And this is another example of you know, bots being used to pump out tons of messages with certain hashtags to try and get those hashtags to spread or to trend on Twitter, which then creates the false impression that this is something that people are really talking about, that there's genuine traction around it, and ultimately maybe to get the media to write about it. Because we are a target of this as well, personally, which Chay will talk a lot about, but also they want our attention and they want us to give exposure to these things. And then, you know, the last piece of this is, you know, there are efforts that are meant to spread certain messages, but there are also efforts to just kind of overwhelm networks and overwhelm a certain type of conversation, so that rather than that uncomfortable issue being something that people talk about and that is really trending, you have governments and other actors trying to kind of create an element of white noise, of inundating with messages about, you know, something maybe a little more lighthearted or silly, to divert attention, to distract attention. This was a research paper published last year that talked about hundreds of millions of social media posts being posted in China to really keep attention away from things that might be inconvenient to the government. So in terms of our approach at BuzzFeed, you know, we started not in news. The company about a dozen years ago was really focused on entertainment, lists and quizzes and that kind of thing. And in doing that, there was always a kind of appreciation for the internet, the ridiculous things on the internet, as well as some of the more serious ones. And that being in our DNA helped us, I think, relatively early on look at this and say, like, this is something worth covering. This is a part of the internet, this element of manipulation and deception. So we take the internet seriously, and that helps drive a lot of our coverage. There are some tools, which I will give you a link to at the end, that we use. These are tools that are largely free, but we also use traditional reporting. You know, there's no magical things. You still have to do all of the usual things. And as I mentioned, I'll give you the list of tools actually is down there on the bottom. If you go to that link, that takes you to a Google Doc that I maintain with some other things that I use on a daily basis. We find that a lot of the tools we're using are not built for journalists, so we adapt them to our needs. And I think we as journalists have to be open to pulling things from other places because they're not purpose-built for us. We do think about this as a global beat. We encourage people everywhere to work on it. We do internal trainings to help them learn these tools. And then, you know, without sort of making them have to report to me, they just go out and they do their stories. And that way we get more done. And we recognize that people are trying to capture our attention. We have a big platform and a big voice. So we try to think about, you know, is this something that we should be giving more attention to? And can, in giving attention to it, reveal what's really going on rather than just kind of mindlessly propagating something. And to just, you know, give an example on that, we think collaboration is really important. So these are stories that were based off of me working with researchers, one, an ad fraud expert, another, a group of researchers who had gathered data from YouTube. So we're constantly looking for data and for other newsrooms and researchers to collaborate with, and that helps scale things up. We are try to be present in places like Discord, on 4chan, wherever we can be, where we know people are planning these campaigns. It's very hard to know where something actually originated if you don't try and get into the spaces where you know known actors are working and planning these things. Again, those private networks are really important for this. When we do an approach, Sheila mentioned the story I did on the left about looking at viral fake stories versus viral real stories in the 2016 election. Once I had sort of developed that methodology, our team in Brazil did it, and our team in other countries did it, and they found the exact same thing. So we develop methodology, and then we share it throughout our organization. And we really work and try to think globally. These are two stories that were published well before the WhatsApp hoaxes and the WhatsApp issue was really something that got global attention. These were both published in 2017, and that's because we were really thinking about this and trying to get everyone in our different offices to actually look at it. And with that, I will leave it to Chay. And again, if you want to see the tools that I'm using, they're right there. And that document is updated regularly. Most of them are free. Some of them may have a little bit of a Western bias in terms of the data you can get, but I think overall you'll find that they work globally. So thank you. I don't have programming skills. I'm very bad at math, which I know journalists like to declare, which I don't think should be a point of pride, but and so a lot of the work that I do is like these tools are not overly complicated. You don't need to be extremely technical. And the stuff that I put on that spreadsheet or on that Google Doc in particular, most of them are free. They're not super technical. And a lot of them, in fact, are ways that you can get data that people might otherwise need to pull from an API that you could get in a more readable format for yourself. So I use a lot of spreadsheets. And I use a lot of tools like CrowdTangle and BuzzSumo and these other things. So I think it's very, very approachable. I think the worst thing you could do is think that, we need to have a big data team to be able to do this. That's not the case. You just have to be really curious, and you have to follow this stuff. And the most important thing I would say is you have to think about it as terms of an ongoing process. So you find Facebook pages, you find accounts, you find WhatsApp groups, you get in them, you track them over time, you monitor them, you get in every morning and you spend 15 minutes looking at all of the stuff, and over time you start to connect the dots. So, the good news is I would definitely encourage you to realize this doesn't need to be super technical, and I think anyone can and should be doing it, and it gives you skills that you can apply to other kinds of stories as well.
So another question, is it worth the effort? Does the exposure of this information actors actually make an impact? Or are we only encouraging them and telling them, to develop new ways of propagating, junk news?
Yeah, there is the arms race element of it, that you expose a technique and maybe Facebook or someone shuts it down and they have to come up with a new technique. But we do see on the being effective front, we see, for example, people who are doing this for a profit, when we expose what they're doing, they get kicked out of the ad networks that they rely on for their money. And sure, another ad network will take them on later, but it's a network that pays them worse. So we're actually forcing them down the funnel so they have less of an economic opportunity. So we see things like that happen when we expose people who are doing it and are doing it completely undercover. Once we expose that they're doing it, a lot of times, they may stop, they may have been shamed from it, maybe they lose the other job they had. But, the other side of it is I do think we have to be realistic about it. And that goes to what I mentioned before about changing people's minds. That's really hard. And if you set that as your bar, you're going to be really disappointed. But I do think that if we make it an ongoing effort, if multiple media organizations are doing this kind of work, if we're able to really get our truthful information out there to counter this from a wide variety of sources, then reaching more people becomes more possible. And over time, that can change perceptions. So I think, be realistic about what you can achieve, but certainly when you expose specific actors and other people involved in it, they often have to move on, they often have to do other things, and that's, that's a result of your reporting that you can certainly be proud of.
Thank you.
Cambridge Analytica story about how a non-media data company was in a way positioned to influence elections even in a country like Sri Lanka. And is it on?
Yeah,
Hello?
just go closer.
Yeah, even in a country like Sri Lanka. And at that time, the INB minister in India issued a statement that he would be calling...
You're too tall for the microphone.
Oh, can I
You could
that?
use this one if you want. It's
Yes.
maybe a bit.
Thank you. Hello. So at that time, the Indian IND minister issued a statement that he would be summoning Mark Zuckerberg to question him about the data leak. And it created a big sort of humorous furore in India because everybody knew that was not happening. And a short while after that, we broke a story in India, Operation 136, over two parts, one in March and one in May, which showed about 45 Indian media platforms willing to indulge in paid news. And it wasn't just, you see, there's been a whole history of Indian media organizations willing to do paid news. Over several decades, there have been several reports in the Press Council of India, etc., etc. And the government was taken up by the fact about the Cambridge Analytica story, which was a non-media company, data company in India, when we broke the story about more than 45 media platforms willing to indulge in paid news. These were licensed companies, television companies. I mean, if I start taking the names, some of the biggest names, Times of India, Circulation of Millions, the largest circulated English paper in the world, India Today Group, both television and magazine, Hindustan Times, Zee News, Network 18, ABP News. What was the sort of specific proposal? The specific proposal was a journalist went to them and said he was pretending to be a leader of a religious organization, and as you know, it's a right-wing government in India, and as a head of a fictitious religious organization, he went to them with a simple proposal, and these were cold calls all the time, largely to media owners and to senior management, that we would be willing to advertise with you for a certain specific sum of money, low as well as high, if you sort of help us in communally polarizing the electorate between Hindu and Muslims, if you sort of defame our political rivals, if you use your investigative teams to investigate our opponents, the other things. And what are the things that they agreed to do, which is more, actually they broke several sections of the Indian Penal Act. They were criminal in their behavior, and they agreed to promote Hindutva, the right-wing Hindu ideology, in the garb of spiritualism and religious discourse. They agreed to publish content with the potential to polarize the electorate around communal lines. They concurred to sort of defame the political rivals. They accepted compensation in cash, unaccounted cash. I mean, they were willing to accept compensation in unaccounted cash. Some of them even agreed to use their platforms, digital, radio, television, that we would interview particular leaders of your choice. We would have panel discussions. We would populate panel discussions with people of your choice. We would agree to plant stories in favor of the party in power in publication. We would develop content for an insidious campaign for you, whether cartoon content or whatever. We will use radio jockeys to promote your content. We would defame particularly. We would taint lawyers who were public interest spirited. We would sort of paint agitating farmers as Maoists. And many of them agreed to promote content which would character assassinate the opposition leaders, and even their own leaders, actually, even the right-wing leaders, they were prepared to defame. And they were ready to run content in a manner that it would look like that is not being paid for, all sort of merged into editorial content, etc., etc. I mean, you name it, whatever vice that you think. So imagine the Daily Mail or the Guardian or the New York. So imagine the New York Times head or the owner of New York Times saying that for money they would be willing to defame all the Republican leaders, and what kind of Senate hearings and what kind of furore it would cause. In India, well, it sort of went viral on social media for a while, maybe about a week, 10 days. There was total silence because the mainstream media at the time had been hurt, and they didn't want, obviously they wouldn't be talking about the news. The other reporters in other media platforms wouldn't talk about it because they wanted jobs in these media platforms. So you don't really go after people whom you would look as potential employers. And there have been a few police FIRs. We don't know still where it will go. Some media platforms sued us, but they withdrew those suits because they knew that if they came up on the stand, then it would be very, very embarrassing for them. So we right now face, except for one or two, there's no legal challenge as well. So it is as if the story didn't happen at all. And I'll just show you a brief clip for you to get an idea about the range of it. I mean, just there are not all 45, about 6 or 7 of the media platforms, for you to just get a feel of the story.
Cobra Post exposes more than 24 media houses, including some prima donnas of Indian media. They do not mind agreeing to undertake a campaign that has potential to not only cause communal disharmony among the citizens, but also tilt the electoral outcome in favor of a particular party.
So my only motive is, my only vision is, my only objective is that BJP has to come into power.
Before I say that, I must tell you, I'm very pro this girl.
Oh, businessman only.
Your money.
Correct. Upon the cash. Could you? You mean you will do Ambedkar? Ambedkar as a candidate. You will take that from him in Delhi. Supposing government says I want it in Ahmedabad, that Ambedkar will have a contact in Ahmedabad. They will exchange the number or number. So we were having some certain discussion about mobilizing cash up to some extent. So wherever you are comfortable with the topic, my guard is there. I mean, my pinpoint guy. I will not involve into this. गाड़ी चली जाएगी यूपी भवन पे, आई एम स्टिल तो वहाँ पे हमारी शासन की व्यवस्था की गाड़ी रहेगी and my guy is still sitting there तो he's bouncing with me. हाँ वो तो discussion काउंटी चला नहीं और मतलब what he wants to know कि कार्ड ये
बात कर लेना कि बात कर लेंगे पहले उनसे आप शायद आप भी बिजी रहते हैं, आप शायद ओपन देखते नहीं हैं। मैं आपको एक बात बताता हूँ, सपोर्ट करते हैं
टीम है जब लोग समय से बात में देखते हैं वो लोग बात करेंगे आपके साथ आपकी कन्वीनियंस से हुआ है कोई बात नहीं आपकी कन्वीनियंस से आपके साथ आ जाए हम लोग उसको बहुत ज़्यादा पोकेट हम लोग उसको आपको कमिट नहीं कर सकते बट नॉट करते तो दिल्ली के लेवल पर वो आपकी कन्वीनियंस से होगा
Firstly, we will look at verified flows if you are looking at what states. 50% of the money will be cash, 50% of the money will be check. The check part needs to come in totality.
Make it specific now what exactly you are saying.
25 share is the deal. Connect. So,
Excluding GST and all.
yes. देखिए, the cash component will reduce to somewhat. Coronel आपके ऊपर reduce to individual about the client. इसके ऊपर we will give you the deal. अभी तक कोई important meeting है So ये जो 12.5 crore हमारी जो deal बनेगी 12.5 crore की deal बनेगी उसमें entitlement सबको दिया जाएगा and accordingly the payment is to be made as full advance. 12.5 means if it's 12.5, this is 50% is to be fully advanced. Now that money will come from which account? Australia account?
Which you are saying you need in check.
और ये अलग अलग के करना पड़ता है और वो संगठन बहुत बोल रहे थे इनकी मर्जी कर रहे थे अगर सॉरी मैं नहीं कर सकता अगर एक निर्णय में उठकर कैंपस से कार्यक्रम साथ पहुंचने के बावजूद इतना लोगों को आप पे नहीं ले सकते क्योंकि क्या है आधे लोग अपने से जुड़ गए ना अपनी सरकार से जुड़ गए हैं बिल्कुल अगर वो भाषा में लाखों की जाहिरात करते हैं अपने मोदी जी की हमेशा वो लोग कैसे वो कुछ कर सकते हैं
इसमें अखबार में जो एडिटोरियल बीजेपी के पक्ष में ही होता है हमेशा कभी भी उसमें खुद दूसरा नहीं आता देखते हो कैसे रोल में बल्कि हमारे जो ऑनर संजय गुप्ता जी उनका खुद का संडे को आता है वो भी उसी के ऊपर आधारित होता है कि उससे मोदी जी और हाईलाइट हो उसको डेली रोज कहता हूँ ये तो हेड ऑफिस से चुनाव होना यहाँ भी ऐसे करते हैं हमको समझ ये बातें होती सेम उसी पैटर्न के ऊपर क्योंकि हर अखबार हमें न्यूज़ तो पब्लिश करने पड़ेगी अपोजिशन भी करने पड़ेगी नहीं है तो लोग भी पसंद नहीं करते हैं इस करके ये कि वेट करना ज़्यादा करना किसका काम करना है तो वो करते रहते हैं
Cobra Post, an investigative news site with a penchant for undercover exposés, posted videos from a secret camera sting operation targeting 27 Indian media outlets, including some of the country's biggest. This story touches on multiple issues, among them paid content disguised as news, as well as the ethics of hidden camera operations.
Yeah, just to answer your previous question, I mean, look at what they were agreeing to do. It is like getting Vineet Jain, Times of India editor, is like getting Rupert Murdoch on camera. And he's willing to accept money in cash, they're willing to polarize the electorate. I mean, sort of run editorials which would favor a particular political regime in power. I mean, what can be worse than that? I mean, at the end of it, you have, as a society, have to compensate the ills of using, the ethics of using hidden cameras versus the positives that it gets you. I mean, in terms of this expose, I mean, what moral standing do any of these media platforms have to run opinion pieces, to run news when they're willing to sort of run anything for money? So, which is at the kernel of the issue.
So, Aniruddha, would you like to come here so
Yeah.
Chay can set up and we can continue this conversation? Do you think, I mean, you said that this story was ignored naturally by the mainstream. Did it, I mean, does exposure actually hinder, do you think this has had a deterrent effect on the big media houses?
Well, you certainly hope that it does have an effect on them. It has had a sort of effect in the sense that their videos are all up on YouTube. They tried to take it down through court action. They were unsuccessful. It's there for everybody. Their conduct is there for everybody to see. Unfortunately, in India, the wheels of accountability don't swing or don't turn so fast. Sometimes they do turn, and sometimes, you know, you're just at the end about why isn't the wheel turning in this instance, and which is something. And the story still hasn't died. It's still in legal action, and you never know the total impact of what will have. I think it will be over some months that you will see it.
So, can you give a little bit of background for people who don't know India, like the amounts involved in your
You see, you have to understand the power of these media organizations. Their reach, which is the point we discussed in the plenary yesterday, which is that we are talking about trolls, we are talking about all this harassment coming in the online space, etc., targeting journalists. Here, these mainstream media with big megaphones, with big social media traction, are willing to do this for you. You don't need so I would say that the enemy is within, it's not really outside of you.
But these media houses were predisposed towards the BJP anyway, right?
Not really, no.
No?
No, they just swing with the party in power.
So they
A
just
lot of them like that. And they are willing to sort of not do what they are supposed to do. And it is just the point that Srinivasan made yesterday, is become good business to be right-wing media in anywhere in the world right now, and specifically in India as well. It pays off in terms of ratings. It pays off in terms of TRP, and it sort of gives them a rating, sort of
Sorry, just say.
exposure which is phenomenal, and it is good business to be right wing in India right now, and which is what they're capitalizing on.
Is that because Modi and BJP are popular, and people want to watch?
Well, they're popular with a certain percentage of people. I wouldn't say that it's about the votes that they polled in the last election were just 31%, but 31% allowed them to sort of swing the country and the parliament seats in their favor. And with regards to media itself, I mean, there was a big furore, there was a big online furore, but as I said, mainstream media affected by it didn't run the story because they themselves were affected by it.
As you know, the president of the Philippines is Rodrigo Duterte. Before he won, his team put in place a very organized team that was focused on social media. So they had the main objective really is for him to win. And we saw that this same team that was put in place during the campaign was preserved all the way when he won as president. The objective of that team was to allow him to govern, because they expected that once you become president, once you win, the media will turn more critical and start to churn out negative stories. So that social media team from the campaign was preserved to defend him against negative reports from the media. So as early as 2016, this was, I think, the first one of the early indications that fake photos were being used on social media. As you know, the president wanted he waged a war against drugs, and you're very familiar with the number of killings, the incredible number of killings, the number of people who have died under this campaign. So just to push back against those who were critical of his campaign, they used this photo. It was posted by one of his people in the campaign, and it shows a photo of a young girl and her mother, and they were saying, "Why are you quiet? Why this young woman has died, and she is the victim of people who are into drugs, and yet you, the media, have been very critical of the campaign." When we did a check, a reverse check of this photo, what we found out was that this picture was not really taken in the Philippines, but was in fact a picture taken in Brazil. And so there was very clearly an attempt at deception and an attempt to disinform. Also in 2016 was the year that he won. We noticed a pattern in certain accounts, and as Craig said earlier, when we started monitoring disinformation and fake news, all these fake information put out on social media, we were very low tech. What we had was a spreadsheet, and we started with 26 accounts. We identified accounts, looked for connections among these accounts, and saw these patterns. What were the indicators that they were fake? One, they were using all these landscape photos and then profile photos of Korean celebrities. Don't ask me why Korean. Instead of using their own photos. And then these accounts also had less than 50 friends. So if you go into the friends list of suspicious accounts, you will see, we saw that, at least for these 4 accounts, they had the exact same number of friends. And these 4 accounts were also connected to each other. So I guess this will bring out the natural in you if you're an investigative journalist. You will just start looking and digging and checking out all these individual accounts. And then before we knew it, we saw that there was a potential reach of millions from just 26 accounts. You plant one fake message or one wrong message, false information in one account, and the spread is just tremendous. We also were able to identify the pillars of disinformation. So we are saying here that disinformation in the Philippines is state-sponsored. How do we know that? There are key persons. These are social influencers who we identified and who were part of the campaign to begin with. So for example, one is a woman, a transgender woman who is based in the Netherlands. Her name is Rogando. She went to the Netherlands for studies. So she graduated and got her master's degree. And she has over 600,000 Facebook followers. So of course, if you were part of the Duterte campaign, this woman is very, very key and very important. And she appealed to what you would call the intellectuals. Second is a woman named Mocha Uzon, sexy dancer, but over 5 million, maybe close to 6 million by now, followers on Facebook. We don't know if this is a combination of authentic followers or fake followers, fake accounts. It's really hard to tell. And if you have 5 million, how can you go through all those 5 million accounts using a spreadsheet? So her appeal as a sexy dancer was really to the masses. And then third is a guy named RJ Nieto who has a blog also on Facebook, and he started out as anonymous. He used the name The Thinking Pinoy, and over 1 million Facebook followers. He also appealed to the middle class. So it's a very, very clever, systematic, organized campaign that we saw, cutting across the different socioeconomic classes of Philippine society: the masses, the middle class, and the intellectuals. And this is propaganda in 2018. We move fast forward to the present. So I will just show you the elements of this campaign. I'm not saying that this is, strictly speaking, the flow or the exclusive flow of the information. So it begins with the social influencer. You seed the false or the fake information to someone who is influential on social media, such as Mocha Uzon. And then it is picked up by mainstream media, a columnist who works for a newspaper that is very, very supportive of the administration. When it's picked up by the columnist or mainstream media, you grant the information that is seeded on social media a degree of legitimacy. And then third, because it's picked up by mainstream media, the president or his spokesman picks it up. They talk about it in a press conference, and that further amplifies the message. So for example, what's one particular example of a false claim that has been amplified? That Rappler is CIA and Rappler is foreign owned. But that has been spread. And then the fourth is the propaganda army itself. It's an entire cycle, and the seeding of false information or fake information can begin either with the propaganda army, it can begin with the president himself, it can begin with a social media influencer, and they feed off each other. And it just goes wild and crazy, and the spread of fake news is just incredible. Recently also, this is what we saw. There have been dormant Facebook fan groups. Again, this is Korean. So this is a particular Facebook fan group which hasn't been that active, and then it was purchased by a political group. How did we see this? Because there was somebody who belonged to the group, to the Korean fan group, and she asked, why has our group been renamed? We are not supporters of Mr. Duterte. We're Korean fan groups. We're a Korean fan group. And we found out that looking at that particular page, it also linked to other pro-Duterte pages. So we see this, we're having elections by next year. So we see this as possibly early preparations for a new level of political campaigning, identifying pages that aren't very active, and maybe could be also entertainment pages, because they already have the mass reach. So you take over those pages and just seed information and fake information on these pages, and the information goes viral. Our reporters have also been under attack. This is Fiera Naga, who covers the president. She has been banned from covering the palace because we ran a critical story. We ran a story which displeased the president, and he attacked her in public, in full view of the other reporters. And if you look at the messaging, these are 3 different accounts, but it's a copy and paste, cut and paste message. Again, looks like apparently Rappler ban now applies to all presidential events, according to Pia. They quote her. So there is a central message that is filtered down, that goes down the propaganda chain, and it's spread. It's the common cut and paste message. Pia is not alone. This is another reporter who was also the target of direct attacks, because she wrote about the possibility of Russian propaganda entering or infiltrating the Philippines. And this is our classic favorite. Maria was, of course, has been at the center of attacks, and this is what they said. Maria, you are a waste of sperm. Your mother should have swallowed you. Get a real job, you doggy, dirty pussy, cunt, motherfucker. I mean, these were very, very strong, in-your-face attacks, and they came every day, and in a matter of an hour. How many? 90 in an hour, and these are messages of hate. So this is what prodded us to look into the accounts, and we've put together, we've monitored accounts and built a database for these accounts. We saw that it's a combination really of what we've been monitoring so far. It's a combination of legitimate news sites, government sites, and disinformation sites. And they feed off each other, because when you share something, you don't really know whether the information that you're getting, what you're sharing from, is legitimate or not, whether it's a fake news site or not, whether it's a troll, you don't really know. And we know that it's also very, very, very smart, actually, because if you look at it, they've been targeting major institutions like the church. The church is very influential in the Philippines because we're predominantly Catholic, and then of course the media has been the favorite target also of the propaganda machine, and they've been spewing out lies. And there's also been an attempt to revise history, because we come from martial law and the experience of Ferdinand Marcos, but now we're seeing that they're trying to change that, and they're using the propaganda machine to make younger Filipinos believe that Ferdinand Marcos was good. He was not really a dictator, and life was better when we had martial law, and that is very, very worrisome for us. So in our campaign, just for the month of May to July, we've been trying to fact check. That's a different, that's a whole discussion altogether. But we've been able to fact check 20 stories a month. And if we had an army with us, the 20 stories can possibly become 100 stories a month. So it's really just a function of limited resources. So very quickly, what are the challenges and what have we learned from our experience? Number one, it's important to build a database. You have to monitor these accounts. You have to know what these accounts are. You have to see the interrelationships between these accounts. When were they created? And who are they interacting with? How do you do this? If you do spreadsheets like what we did initially, it's going to be, what you're going to see will be very, very limited. But we have a very small data team, research team that understands social media monitoring. And what they try to do is to scrape publicly available data from Facebook. The emphasis here, it's public, because of course there are privacy issues. We look out for, when we tag accounts and put them into our database, these are the things that we look out for. Repetitive messages, threatening language, anger and hate that's being provoked, and the use of exaggeration. And whenever we discover nodes or nests, because we know that they are nodes or nests because they're interconnected with each other, we do not immediately flag them, because we want to see as much as possible. It's like trying to track a drug syndicate. You don't immediately expose, but you look at how they operate, you look at how they behave, and then hopefully you wish that you would see the original source of that disinformation rather. What is helpful to be able to see that is a visualization tool, and in our case we use Flourish. And because you're really up against an army, or probably armies, one media organization can't fight all these armies. So we said we need to build a community among stakeholders, media stakeholders, people who believe that it's important to have a free and independent media. So we've teamed up with media, other media organizations, academics, and civil society. And we've held meetings so that we could agree on, okay, you do your own campaigns against disinformation, and then let's come together and identify the critical accounts. And we've also been paying attention to the comment section lately, because this is another pattern that we're seeing. Initially, we were just looking at the accounts themselves, but you post a story on Facebook, and then all these persons and these trolls get into the comment section and then post something, information that is so totally unrelated to the story that you're sharing, and then they begin a whole chain of discussions, and before you know it, the comment section has been hijacked. Your story that you've shared on Facebook is no longer the focus. It's just the comment section already. So what are we up against? We're up against creators of fiction, and it's contrary to our core and to our values as journalists. We want to fight falsehood, but it's a machine, and it's like they operate like terrorist cells. You identify a mode, you expose the mode, but they will show up in another form. And it's so easy to create accounts anyway on these social media platforms. So the question for us is, do we continue doing this? Especially if it seems to be a futile exercise. We cannot stop totally the manufacture of fake news and fake information, because there is an agenda, there is a political agenda, and they will not stop. So I will end by asking that question: Is it really worth our time, or are we being distracted from our core work, which is exposing crime, exposing corruption, exposing bribery, and exposing abuses, instead of going after all these anonymous accounts who will end up anyway in some other new form.
Thank you, Chay. Thank you. devoting, quite a good portion of your time and effort and resources into exposing and tracking disinformation. Is it worth it? That's question number one. And question number two, and this may be an unfair question. You are both the target and the reporter of disinformation.
Right.
What does, that is a very strange position to be in. You're both the victim and you are the you expose the victimization. So tell us about, the difficulties involved in that.
Okay, first of all, is it a futile exercise and do we continue doing it? I think we have no choice. We have to do it because otherwise it will really become, Facebook will be a cesspool. I mean, it's not as if it isn't right now. But we have to continue the effort to keep on trying to clean it up because otherwise they will get the impression that, it's like I've conquered this domain, I've conquered this social platform, there is no resistance. There has to be a degree of resistance. And media cannot do it alone. That's why I stress the importance of collaboration. But if you have limited resources like we do, probably what you can do, what I would do is still to continue the effort, maybe have one person or two persons dedicated to that particular effort, but not focus exclusively on that campaign. Because the bigger stories, the more explosive stories need manpower and need resources. So you have to be very selective and you just have to choose and prioritize what should be more important at a particular point in time. I mean, with elections coming up, we cannot not fight fake news and disinformation on the social media platforms. On the second question, are we biased when we report about disinformation? We're very, very self-conscious because we know that if we expose accounts that are only identified with administration or Mr. Duterte, then we would become more vulnerable. And they would say, see, you're just exposing us, you're not looking at the opposition. And in fact, we have this partnership with Facebook, and Facebook, because of that partnership, we have a dashboard. So the dashboard will list all the suspicious accounts. And we very, very consciously look for accounts that are not just Duterte, pro-Duterte, but accounts that are also identified with the opposition. And even accounts that have been spreading false information about health issues, public interest issues, not just political issues.
Thank you. Just a bit of context here before. In the Philippines, which I think is one reason why it's different in India, in the Philippines, almost everybody is on Facebook. Right. Because of Facebook Free Basic. So Facebook is the internet to most Filipinos. And in India, there is no Free Basic, right? And so you have to pay to get internet access to be able to. So this is why there's disproportionate influence of Facebook in the Philippines and in India, and so the vectors of disinformation are different. So I don't want to monopolize this. I want to give you all a chance to ask questions.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm an undergraduate student reporting on the conference here, and I was wondering what you guys would want to see from technology companies and platforms like Facebook, Google, other things people are using in terms of their role in combating fake news. Like, you mentioned that you have a partnership with Facebook. Like, how helpful has that been? What else would you want to see?
Okay, Chay, go ahead.
Platforms are key, actually. I forgot to emphasize that in my presentation. They're part of the solution. And Maria tried to get in touch with Facebook as early as 2016, calling their attention to what we were seeing as the fake accounts. But Facebook wouldn't listen. They were practically ignoring us. And we said, okay, we're just a small country, little Philippines in Southeast Asia, so not worth the attention of Facebook. It was only this year that Facebook went into this partnership. And we are grateful for that because I think it's admission on their part that this is a serious problem, and And what is happening on Facebook has really affected democracies and has encouraged the rise of autocrats and dictators. And we're seeing that in our country. So Facebook has been a little more proactive, and that's a good thing. But it's hard, it's tough, because yes, they provided us access to the dashboard, which identifies suspicious accounts. But the question also there is, how quick, how fast are you able to act on complaints, and how quick are you to be able to close down these critical accounts?
Craig, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. So, I mean, to pick up from where Chay just left off, them being able to actually enforce what they say their policies are would be the first thing I would want from them, because the scale at which they operate, I mean, Facebook and Google between them announced that they're hiring somewhere between like 10 and 20,000 people to help with content moderation this year. But from what my sense is, most of those jobs are being contracted out to third parties. These are not high-paying, high-quality jobs within these organizations themselves. And so they have a huge responsibility for content monitoring and moderation, but they're actually treating that as an arm's length thing when it's actually the core of what they do. So if they could actually enforce their policies as consistently, that would be the first thing that would be really helpful. Second thing is data-wise, especially since Cambridge Analytica, there is less data available from Facebook. There is less data available from YouTube and other places, because they're using that as justification to kind of shut off APIs. And so one of the things I would like to see from them is actually figuring out ways for them to make data available to newsrooms. They're doing this in the US with researchers with Facebook, but there's nothing for newsrooms. The other challenge that's in the US, I'm based in Canada, but we focus a lot on the US, is that there's a really bad law in the US where if you go and scrape data from Facebook, you could potentially be charged with a felony. And so I would like to see them create a kind of safe harbor for newsrooms doing that. But I mean, for me, I think the really big thing is like, realize that you have this huge responsibility of what is on your platform. You have these policies, do what you need to do to enforce them. And also, as you hire people to work on that, don't subject them to PTSD and not give them any support, because I think that creates a whole other vicious cycle.
Craig, given the recent the revelations about Facebook's role in the U.S. elections, do you think Facebook is now much more serious than it was, say, 2 years ago in addressing some of these issues?
Yeah, there's no question. I would say more than other platforms, Facebook has been doing more. They've taken more heat, but they actually have, I mean, so in the fall of 2015, I was researching misinformation, and I spoke to somebody at Facebook, and I said, you've got a real problem here. These fully fake stories are getting so much engagement. And they asked about my research project. They're like, so how are you doing this? I'm like, well, we identify rumors and then we track them, and, we do journalism to figure out whether they're true or not. I'm like, oh, damn, because they were hoping like we had a special magical thing that would just, just knock, that's how they think. And now they realize that this is actually requires a huge amount of human effort. So Facebook has done a lot. There's still a lot more to do, but they have engineering and product teams. They've created this worldwide partnership with third-party fact checkers, which, by the way, also gives them the training data they need to train the algorithms. So that's the other piece of this fact-checking project that I think people overlook, is by getting good quality fact checkers to declare when things are false, they can then use that to train their AI to hopefully get better. But they still, there's still a lot of work to be done. I think Google and Twitter are behind them.
Thank you.
We work on social media verification. I just wondered, obviously, one of the problems is that people actually want to believe some of this fake news. So I just wondered if you could reflect on why that is at the moment, and why as journalists, we're kind of facing this uphill battle to prove that what we do is justified and worth reading.
Why is it so hard for journalists to be credible to people? Why is the fake news narrative getting traction? Aniruddha.
Well, to take the mainstream perspective, it is somehow converting into large readerships. If you somehow appeal to the to hatreds, to bias, it is giving them dividends, and we have seen that in India. Just speaking about India, and that whether it is television or whether it is print, I mean television largely, and even the digital space, I mean the online space, Facebook as well as, if the more extreme your position, the more of an audience that you get. And I think a lot of newsrooms are unable to step away from that and not do that, because there is a immediate sort of gain to it, immediate dividends that they make in terms of revenues, in terms of ratings. And I think that there is not enough social pushback on what they are doing, because there's a whole constituency out there which wants their ideology reinforced by what they read. And so they've divided audiences into various pigeonholes, and you just sometimes, as you say, want to reinforce your bias or your particular hate that you have. And so in a large sense, there's a lot of, it reflects the society that we live in, and they're just cashing in on it.
Yes, Chay.
As far as the media is concerned, I think we also have our shortcomings. Sometimes in one of the discussions we had earlier, we said that maybe we haven't been paying too much attention to what the readers really need, what they want. And so they look elsewhere. They're looking for alternatives. But the second point also is, it's also a commercial enterprise. The spreading of false news, people are hired to do that. Trolls are hired. It's a livelihood. And if you're not, if you're not a college graduate, for example, and it's very difficult for you to scale in the socioeconomic ladder, then it's a quick way to earn money. You become recruited by the troll farms, and you become a troll and get paid, and you're all you need is a laptop, and you just click and spread and share.
That in many countries we're seeing campaigns to delegitimize legitimate media as well, and that helps lay groundwork. One of the things that we see in a lot of sort of Western democracies is that trust levels, not just in the media, but in all institutions, government, business, and other things are falling. And part of that, I think, is because we have access to more information. We see the flaws of our institutions, but when those institutions are being eroded and attacked, then something has to fill that gap. And things that appeal to bias, things that give us comfort because they align with what we already believe, that is something that people hold on to. And especially if it's coming from a friend group or a family group and people are sharing that information with them, that is what they latch onto when they don't have as much faith in institutions. So I think there is that broader piece of it as well.
Thank you. Yes, please. Identify yourself.
Hi, IT cell alone. Within the IT cell and outsourced is reportedly more than 500 people.
IT cell, what is that?
The information technology cell, with responding in the social media. So yes, we in fact did a story a few years back in the run-up to the 2014 election about these social media messaging companies which were sprouting all over Delhi and Bombay and other places, where they were willing to do all kinds of stuff for you for money, which is basically erase your Google search record, defame your political opponents. There's a whole industry out there which helps politicians achieve what they want to achieve for money, because all politicians in India now want social media accounts, and they really are technologically not equipped to do it. So they outsource these to other commercial companies, and those commercial companies then end up selling them all kinds of services. And of course, a lot of it is, as you said, very, very organized, which is your big, they are basically outsourcing a lot of the dirty work outside. So there's the element of distance, and then they can claim that we don't know anything about it. And internally as well, they have big teams doing all this.
Chay?
We've been trying to track troll farms in the Philippines, and we've seen that, okay, there are a lot of rumors that go around, and then they say that this particular building in this particular area, we suspect that there's a troll farm. And the commonality is that those buildings house BPO companies or operations. And in Mindanao, for example, we're working on this story at the moment.
we observed, so we looked at population in a particular city, and then we looked at the number of Facebook accounts. And the number of Facebook accounts far, far, far outweigh the population. And so our suspicion is it's possible what we have to look at still is the number of BPOs in these cities and see whether there is a correlation. We'll tell you about that when we have our findings.
I'd like to take a bigger view here. Is you have the rise here, both Philippines and India have a large English educated and technically savvy digital labor force. And they have been consigned to sort of the sweatshops of the global digital economy. And they're being paid very low wages. And in fact, it's not surprising that many of the most ardent pro-Duterte supporters work for these BPOs. And why is that? Because they see that they have no chances to advance in this beyond the sweatshop world. And so there's a lot of resentment. So it's not just money, I think. There's also a lot of resentment against their place in the global economy. And I think that is something we have to reckon with. The other actors here that we haven't really looked at are public relations and strategic communications companies who are in the employ not just of political parties, but also of corporate brands. And they hire these social media influencers. They pay them money to tweet, to post on Facebook, to put in viral videos in Instagram. And some of them are international public relations firms. Some of them make a lot of money and they have not been held to account to a global sort of professional standard of how they should behave, the ethics of their behavior in the online media space. And I think that is where there is some work to be done. You know, the big multinational PR companies and the public relations industry, and many of us, we don't have a public relations school in Colombia, but many universities all around the world have public relations schools that train the next generation of communications professionals. I think we should be teaching ethics, especially in the use of the online space, within the PR industry and within the communications profession as more broadly.